Hello and welcome to another filler episode for the Secrets of the BBFC podcast. As always, my name's Tom. I'm your host, and I was actually planning to do this episode as a main one, but the person I was originally going to do it with couldn't do it, so I've got Rob instead to do it with me. Because whenever I'm having trouble with stuff, I sort of ask him, and he's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." So, welcome, Rob, again to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. Good to have you back as well. And today we're going to be discussing the extremes of the 12 rating. So, by that I mean I'm going to be talking about the low end of 12A and the high end of 12A. So, we'll be looking at quite a few case studies in that respect to just to beef up the argument a bit. So I guess first of all, we've got to take a look at what the 12 and the 12A ratings actually are. So obviously 12A is, it's for cinemas only in the UK. It means that no one aged 12 and under can see a film, a 12A rated film, unless they're accompanied by an adult.
No one, no one under 12 can see it without an adult. A 12-year-old can see it unaccompanied.
Yeah, they can. Yeah. So, sorry about that. Just a slight mistake there. So yeah, no one under the age of 12 can see a 12A rated film unless they're accompanied by an adult.
Which does differentiate it from America's PG-13, where the 13 is completely advisory and anyone of any age can see it unaccompanied. Although it is advised that under 13s would be should be accompanied by an adult.
Yeah, there's obviously it's still a relatively strict rating, even though it's technically an advisory rating. It's sort of similar to the Australian MA15 plus rating, which essentially means
or America's R rating, which is essentially 17A.
Yeah, no, that essentially is a 17A rating, which bit of an interesting one, but I guess it does sort of make sense when you consider the fact that the majority of ratings around the world around that age level are advisory anyway, so that would make sense.
Well, according to Wikipedia, also I know I interrupted you earlier, and yeah, the MA15 plus in Australia, yes, is 15A. But as I was going to say, according to the Wikipedia article, which I had shared with you at point, yes, it's not so much advisory. What they mean that it's partially restricted in that if you're under the age, you can only see it if you're accompanied by an adult, as opposed to fully restricted, which means if you're under the age, you're not allowed to see it under any circumstances. Like our 15 and 18, Australia's R18 plus, and America's NC 17.
Yeah, obviously there's a there's a distinction that we need to make there. So that's what it essentially is. So that's I suppose we can start with sort of the low end of 12A. So I suppose there are some people that would argue that the 12A rating has sort of become a PG plus rating. So what I mean by that is that excuse me, is that the content is a little bit too strong for PG, but it's not a comfortable 12. It's just about a 12, which
I would. I was going to add that ever since 12 changed to 12A, the lower end has extended quite some bit. I mean, I have mentioned on previous podcasts, I mentioned it quite extensively on our 15A podcast, how back in the day in the 90s, I couldn't tell where PG ended and 12 began because so many films that were rated, that were given PG-13s in America were rated either or here, like for instance Jurassic Park on one end and Independence Day on the other, and how do you come to that that conclusion? But of course nowadays they both be rated 12A. But yeah, I mean there are some films that are rated 12A here that are only PG in America. A good example would be, well, I say an example, I don't have a good example. Tomorrowland, which I haven't seen by the way, but started a George Clooney. And there were some anime films like Your Name that have been rated PG in America, but 12A here. I don't know how they've come to those conclusions. Oh, there's also that House with a Clock in the Walls or something, or some shit like that with Jack Black in.
Oh yeah, that one.
I think I've just bogarted the conversation here, but I'll throw it back to you now.
Oh, that's okay. So yeah, that's obviously the 12A rating. It used to be a lot broader than it is now, because obviously like you just had some films that like the crossover between PG-13 and 12A can be a bit of a tricky one at times, especially when you consider that you've got both PG rated and R films in the US, which are 12A rated in the UK, and like the the PG ones probably constitute the lower end 12A ones over here, like The House with the Clock in Its Walls, as you just mentioned.
Which I've not seen, by the way. I mean,
oh yeah, no, me neither. But it's probably one of those relatively tame 12 rated films.
it's
I
just
guess,
more of a safety precaution of a BBFC to rate it that rather than PG, just to say, yeah, well, we did rate it this in case your kid gets scared or something like that.
yeah. And another film I was thinking of was the Ant-Man films, because they're pretty low end 12A films. If
To
we're
be
being
honest,
honest here.
I think a lot of them MCU films are. I mean, other than their rather flippant swearing, like they throw the word shit around quite frequently and everything. There's not a huge amount of. I mean, there is on-screen violence, and yeah, some grittier films like Captain America might be a bit on the nose, but I mean, yeah, Ant-Man is a very fantastical one. The first Avengers was as well. Thor and Iron Man, maybe, I don't know, but yeah, a lot of the MCU stuff is quite quite easygoing, going fair. Although again, all PG-13 stateside, so make of that what you will.
Yeah, definitely. And like I'd say, like earlier MCU films tended to be on the grittier end of the spectrum than more recent films, with maybe the possible exception of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which I'll come on to a bit later in the podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, you had films like Iron Man. I think there's a scene in Iron Man where the main character's tortured quite a bit, which is it's probably kind of surprising considering like some of the content that's passed in like Ant-Man and Ant-Man and the Wasp being on the tame end of the spectrum. It might come as a surprise, but I guess it might be a sign as to like how diluted 12A has become in recent years. Do you want to add to that?
Well, possibly. Like I say, there are some very tame 12As. I mean, the first Spider-Man, quite tame. I suppose it is, but it does have some heavy revenge themes. But yeah, I mean, actually, no, that's a bit silly thing because I remember they said the first Spider-Man had to be toned down to avoid an R rating. Spider-Man 2 is a lot tamer, but that's PG rated. Spider-Man. Obviously, we're going to talk about the Dark Knight trilogy again because we always will when we're talking about this. And I mean, I think they're all okay at 12A. Especially, I actually think Dark Knight Rises is more violent than Dark Knight, especially how Bane kills people. I'm going to assume you haven't seen any of those films yet, or have you?
Not quite yet, but I've been meaning to.
Yeah, you do need to, but they are some brilliant films. I mean, Christopher Nolan films, generally, while they all do fit into the 12A, they all can be quite hard 12As, even though he doesn't like to put much bad language in his movies. I mean, there was Dunkirk, which doesn't pull many punches, but with a war film, we usually expect an R/15 rating, so make of that what you will. But then again, we could probably compare that film to 1917, which you might consider to be on the low end of a 15 and could be a high 12/8. I don't know. I mean, just this morning, I watched that 2019 Brad Pitt film, Ad Astra.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a high-end 12A. I mean, the BBFC website does say cuts, but it doesn't say what it was cut for. And on IMDb, there's no alternative versions which indicate any footage was removed. And we don't know what the BBFC could have cut. For all we know, they could have just seen an MPAA symbol and had to cut that out just to not confuse the audience, and that would be officially considered a cut. So, but there's one scene involving some baboons in Ad Astra, and anyone who's watched the film will know what I'm talking about, or at least they've watched it on streaming. I don't know if this was cut out from the cinema, but I mean, there's guy's got a hand that's been chewed off, and you do see some quite close up, a few clips of his bloodied stump, and it's wow. I mean, that is pushing the. I don't know if that was cut out of the theatrical release for its 12A, but if it wasn't, yeah, that's going to be very higher end of 12A.
Yeah, just to give some context here, the film itself wasn't actually cut. The cuts were just the trailers to remove the MPAA symbol at the beginning of the trailer, which is understandable because like the BBFC have done that pretty routinely. But no, all of what Rob's been saying there was past 12 uncut by
Have you seen
the
the movie?
BBFC. No, I haven't seen it. I think I've been meaning to, but I haven't
Well,
haven't
put it
seen
this
that
way,
one quite yet.
without getting too much spoilers, but it's a scene involving baboons. When you see it, you'll know what I mean.
It sounds strange, but I'm gonna take your word for it and try and see it at some point.
Yeah. Other than that, I mean, obviously, I've talked about Alita Battle Angel until the cows come home, which even in a lot of Americans can't believe that it got away with a PG-13, let alone our 12A, because again, it is fantastical, and you know what they say about fantasy violence. They will just basically just say, open the door and say, through you go, all yours. Um, but yeah, there's a lot on this screen that makes you think, wait, that got through, but this other film couldn't get away with it. I mean, you wonder if they have any rules or if they have any consistency, or if they're just going by their own personal feelings. Uh, okay, but it's nice to know that they can let that go. So, and yes, we will bring up America's PG-13 because you can't. I don't think you could talk about our 12A rating without talking about America's PG-13 at the end of the day. Yeah, in terms of higher end, that's higher end of violence, higher end of language. Again, there is 2019's Fighting with My Family, which has, I wouldn't say it's swearing, it's more just rude language, which has quite flippantly, hence why it was rated 15A in Ireland and was cut to avoid an R rating in America, like the phrase "dick me dead, bury me pregnant" having to be cut out for its second time it's mentioned. And of course, the next year, the Jim Broadbent film The Duke, which, according to IMDb, has 8 F-bombs in it, of which only 5 are audible. But you can imagine 5 F-bombs is quite a fair amount. I mean, especially on two occasions, there's 2 F-bombs mentioned in quite near close to each other. And no surprise, it was rated R in America. So yeah, that's in terms of language, that's quite higher end, along with Life of Brian, which is now a 12A.
Oh yeah, no, that's one people might not necessarily know about. Obviously, well, that was 15 for many years, but in I think it was 2020, it was given a theatrical re-release and was passed with a 12A rating for the first time, despite the film having about 6 or so uses of strong language, I think it was.
I think it's 6 F-bombs, yes. Although I've only heard 5 when I watched it, but I could have easily missed one. But yeah, it's six F-bombs and 2 scenes of full frontal nudity.
Fair enough. I mean, the limits were there to be tested, as some people might say.
Yeah. Yeah, it was 4 years ago in 2019. It was re-released, and yeah, they gave it a 20. Well, if you have strict set rules and you have your boundaries for your ratings, the boundaries are there for a reason. And if a film doesn't break them, it doesn't break them. I mean, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing. So, so we've been talking a bit about higher end 12s now. Obviously, we've mentioned the sort of ones that we've usually mentioned on podcasts. You know, The Dark Knight, Elite Battle Angel, Fighting with My Family, etc., etc., etc. But one film that we haven't really been able to mention because it's a pretty recent one is the new Guardians of the Galaxy film. Now, this one's been pretty controversial in both the UK and the US. So there were reports in the US of people saying that it definitely earned its PG-13 rating. And there was even an article in the Independent in the UK that said that many parents thought that the new film wasn't really acceptable at 12A, and that the film should have been rated 15 instead.
That does make me swear in response, but never mind.
No, go for it. It's all yours.
Well, no, I mean, I didn't want to. No, I mean, I wanted to let you say what you think we got going, but I've I don't. I've seen the film. Did you say you've seen it, or have you not seen it?
No, not yet.
Oh, you got to see it. It's great. No, it is. There are some distressing scenes, as in they can tug on your emotional heartstrings and everything. But obviously, that's no reason to give it. They guess there's more threat. There is some violence. I guess it was far more violent than the first 2 Guardians of the Galaxy films. So probably just by comparison, people were quite taken aback by how much stronger it is. But I do not think under any circumstances it should have had anything higher than a 12A. It is, yeah, it is a 12A. It's a kind of film that a 12A is and the PG-13 is made for. I mean, there is one strong piece of violence at the end, which I can't really get into just through the spoilers and everything. But it may remind you a bit of the that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end, if you know.
I do know what you're talking about. I'm not sure whether we should mention this because of spoilers, but let's just say it's let's just call it the should we call it the face scene?
Yeah, the face scene, yes. And anyone who's seen Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 now knows what I'm talking about. So I mean, I just think I do think people have very short memories of this because last year's Doctor Strange 2 was far worse. Oh, well, far. I say far. It was worse anyway, and that got through them at 12A, and that was really the upper end, pushing the limits and everything. Because you see a lot of films that the BBFC have given 15s to, just either for which were but nonetheless PG-13 in America, but either for violence or just for scary content, such as last year's Batman or Morbius, which is crap. Or the Venom, or most of these PG-13 rated slasher or horror films, which aren't even that scary or anything. And it's like, okay, you've said that that's too scary or maybe a little bit too violent to be passed at 12A. I mean, in freaking Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, there's a scene where like a guy's just brain explodes or something, or another uh, another guy has his head ripped into or something. I mean, again, I'm talking briefly here, but I mean, And what's her face? Elizabeth Olsen's Wanda character or Scarlet Witch character is walking around with blood on her face, and some of the more darker scenes remind me of a 2019 film Brightburn, with that just sense of evil and dread surrounding it. And you just got impression that if it hadn't been for the established Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the lore and the characters and everything, the BBFC probably would have slapped it with a 15. I actually want to give props to the BBFC and commend them for actually having the balls to pass it 12A.
Yeah, no, and you do sort of get the sense that the meaning of a 12 rated film is slightly being lost a bit. So it's not. I think there are reports that um, the parents who complained about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 were taking their young children to see it. It's
Which
not a film for young children. It is a film for people aged 12 and older, really.
I reckon a 10-year-old could handle it, but I mean, a 10-year-old, yes, 5-year-old, no.
Yeah, it's not the new PG.
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
you wouldn't.
well, I mean, considering what Jaws was like back in the day, that was a PG. I mean, but even then, that was back then as like parental guidance. So like, fucking be careful what you take your kids to goddamn see. I mean, yeah, I can understand why parents would complain that Watership Down was rated U, which we've discussed ad infinitum here, because the U should basically probably be indication that yeah, this is appropriate to take little Johnny Piss Pants to go and see. But I mean, the old school PG was like maybe don't take little Johnny Piss Pants to go see it. Wait till at least 8 or more, and then that, as was the case of Jaws, because that could frighten kids, just have a shark eats people. But yeah, I mean, when you get to the 12A, it's like at least wait till they're 10, or maybe 8, I don't know, but at least wait till they're 10 before you take them to see, you know, yeah, Doctor Strange 2 or Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3.
Yeah, and it's like you've also got the fact that Doctor Strange 2 was directed by Sam Raimi, who is obviously infamous for directing the Evil Dead franchise, well, the original trilogy, that is. And it was obvious he was going to bring his horror
Yeah.
trademarks.
Well, he also did that 2009 film, Drag Me to Hell, which inexplicably did get a PG-13 in America, but it was rated 15 here and MA 15 plus in Australia. So it wasn't just a BBFC being knee-jerk reaction there. That should not have been rated PG-13. But yeah, you're right when you talk about the parents being needing a bit more responsibility because, as you mentioned earlier, well, okay, I mentioned it, but you mentioned Australia's MA 15 plus, and I mentioned America's R, which is 17A, so parents can take their kids to see that. But at least in America, you admit parents know not to. It's like just because you can take your kid to something doesn't mean you should. You know, this is where you need to make the effort to just learn about a movie and decide if you think your little kid can go and see it. Sure, I mean, parents did go take their kids to see The King's Speech in America because obviously that was a film that probably should have been PG-13 and was 12A here. That's fine for kids to see. You know, taking them to see uh, Logan or Joker or John Wick, no.
Yeah, it's. I feel like the whole point of the 12A rating, as they explained in like 2014 by the BBFC, was that some kids can handle certain 12A rated content, others can't. It's a very like diverse thing, and the BBFC, recognized that, so they introduced it. The whole point wasn't that it became the new PG-13, and you would have films like Ant-Man be passed at 12A, and then people then would complain that certain films which were meant to be passed at 12A in the first place are then past 12A, and then people complain about it. It's a weird cycle that sort of it leaves the BBFC in a bit of an impossible position where they're trying to please everyone. And as another guest on the podcast said, like there isn't really a situation where the BBFC can do that because there are always these problems.
Exactly. I mean, you talk about the complaints that they got for, or are probably likely to get. We'll have to wait till next year's report. But complaints they're probably getting for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. But could you imagine the complaints they would have got if they had rated it 15 and parents couldn't take their kids to go see it?
Oh, you know that they would have been just that they would have probably been banging on the doors of the BBFC's headquarters. A couple of them with axes, maybe, if they're feeling peckish, you know.
Exactly. I mean, and I don't blame parents for getting pissed off at the BBFC for not letting them take their kids to see it. I mean, in the end of the day, I don't want to live in a country where we accept being told what to do and everything. The BBFC. I know we're going back to our 15A rating and not to 12, not down the 12 rating, but the BBFC say there's no call or demand for a 15A rating, but that's bollocks. I mean, you're probably asking a question, but you're asking it a certain way. Whereas if you would ask like parents, would you like more control over what you can and can't take your kids to see at the cinema? Yeah, I mean they'd undoubtedly say yes. You just have after you said about Venom, and you said it. Well, okay, Venom should have been 12A. Christ. I mean, one might say actually, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and Doctor Strange 2 are actually stronger than Venom. So make of that what you will. But yeah, 1917, they should have probably been allowed to see that. But just when you consider that parents in America and Australia can take their kids to see R and 15, MA 15 plus films, I think they should be allowed to here as well. I mean, they just got to learn just to be a bit more cautious and take more responsibility.
Well, and also you could argue that it's like it's also the BBFC's responsibility to clarify what the 12A rating means in the first place, so that confusion doesn't happen, and so the BBFC aren't persistently bombarded with complaints from people who don't understand what the ratings actually mean. It like there's a hell of a lot of confusion that like PG is PG's almost become like a you like thing, and I know we're sort of going a bit off topic here.
No, we are.
But
We might be, but that does lean into something I was going to say next. So continue, and I'll.
so even a film like I Love Dogs is probably considered sort of top end PG nowadays, and because PG has become significantly tamer, which in some ways it's good. I mean, passing the Indiana Jones films at PG probably were a bit of a mistake.
For the 80s, I mean, PG meant more back then, though.
Yeah, that's true.
Remember, Jaws was a PG as well, so you can't really like point at the Indiana Jones films and say it shouldn't be PG when Jaws was wearing a PG on it, was like wearing a PG on its sleeves all that time. And I don't know if you've seen Jaws. I mean, you must have seen it once. Have you seen Jaws?
Not yet.
Oh, good grief, man!
I know. I'm sorry.
Jaws is considered by many to be one of the most hardcore PG films, and it's a 12 now, obviously, as you might know, but PGs ever to have walked the earth, and with like good reason. I mean, it's like you watch it, it's like, how is this PG? It's like, dude, this isn't the modern PG of Frozen and Kung Fu Panda. This is what PG meant back then. It wasn't a U rating. Stop thinking of it in that terms.
Yeah, no, it is kind of strange, and like the problem with the PG rating being tightened up is that now 12A films are becoming a lot tamer as well. So the actual meaning of what 12A means is being diluted, which makes films like I don't know, Mission Impossible Fallout or something look like near 15s, even though they're like pretty comfortable 12A films, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I remember my mum used to tell me about how during the 60s and everything, they only had the three ratings, U, A, and X. And obviously, yeah, I mean, U was basically that's for your kid-friendly films. That's the films that you take that you leave the kids in the cinema to go see and everything, just so they can all your little uh fantasy, little kiddie winksy films, Disney stuff. And there's that's your family friendly middle of the road films, which are like probably not really suitable for kids. They're more to entertain. They can sort of entertain maybe older kids, and adults can can appreciate them as well. But then you got your X, which is like, okay, kids must not see it. It's just purely for adults and everything. Of course, now we have the 5 ratings, but both U and 18 are quite outliers now. So I can't help but thinking of like PG being the U, 12A being the A, and 15 being the X. And I really think that's why we've really got what it's like in America, because G and NC-17 are practically never used. So you just basically PG, PG-13, and R, and they can be seen with that sort of dichotomy. And I really think people need to view it more that way, because 12A is the central money maker for the films that aren't necessarily solely for adults, but aren't patronizingly kiddish.
Yeah,
If you
no,
get where I'm
there's
going with this.
yeah, and as I said before, it means that those films that are that aren't really meant for younger children, they're sort of meant for sort of young teens, let's say, and above, are people say that they should be rated 15, and
That's just
and of course,
but then
like
the other
15 rated films, like they're not the same thing, you know.
well, yeah, I mean, in a 15 rate film, that basically is your uh well, that is your for mature films. I know you've got the 18s going to the really extreme stuff, but obviously you've got your John Wicks and your Deadpools and your Logans, as well as like your your first Suicide Squad, and as well as things like your American Pies, where people could say was like motherfucker around their heart's content and just makes all kinds of strong sexual references, and even say cunt quite a few times. And it's like, yeah, because it's for grown-ups. I mean, as I've mentioned, in some countries, parents could take kids to see those films, but I mean, over here we can't. So you'd think that like the 15 should be a bit more. Uh, so giving someone a 15 as opposed to a 12A is a bit more of a definitively. Oh, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I mean, but we've discussed, probably moving on to the next subject. We discussed the lower end of 12A. We discussed the higher end of 12A. I mean, the middle, solid, firm center of 12A. I mean, that's films like Transformers or Pirates of the Caribbean uh, or that almost James Bond, most James Bond films. Well, a typical James Bond type action film, or that 2013 film White House Down. Yeah, your typical Roland Emmerich schlock, which is just big disaster porn, which is and the Fast and the Furious films, of course, just your big budget disaster, a blockbuster schlock, which isn't particularly violent, doesn't push any boundaries, but of course you might hear an F bomb. You're probably going to hear the S word a few around, bandied around the place. People will get killed in it, and it's and well, yeah, you might, gosh darn it, see a bit of blood. It just won't go, just won't be excessive. It. It's, something someone who's just started high school can probably handle without any issue.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's middle of the road 12 films are getting increasingly rarer in sort of mainstream film culture. What with all of the films from the MCU, or in the odd case, the sort of higher end ones, the middle of the road ones, you you can find them, but they're probably not as mainstream as
Well,
they used to be.
I don't know, and I mean, I can't wonder if that just runs contrary to what I just said. I mean, like I say, most superhero fare probably is that stuff, and and of course, okay, no, they don't make many Transformers films. Well, there's one coming up this year. The Transformers films and all these huge budget blockbusters. Well, but last year's Avatar film, I haven't seen it, but I mean, I'm guessing that would just be firmly where the 12A belongs. And most Fast and Furious films. I'm just trying to. I heard last year's Black Adam film, which I haven't seen because I've heard it's absolute crap, is a bit pushing the boundaries of what's the violence should be acceptable at 12A, because I heard them say the same thing in America at PG-13, because there is quite a lot of death in it, albeit it's probably bloodless carnage where you just see the violence but not the consequences of the violence. So hey, isn't that great? But that does make you think, though, doesn't it? You're more like you get the lower rating by not showing the consequences of the violence that's on screen. It's like, doesn't that go against the whole reason why you're giving these films these ratings? If you think
It's
about it.
Yeah, and I this is probably going really off topic, but uh, the films I think of when this sort of thing is discussed are the Equalizer films, but obviously they're 15/18, so again probably veering a bit off topic there, but yeah, well, I mean, I'd say the bloodlust issue is probably more of an issue with the PG-13 rating than the 12A rating. Because with 12A, at least you can show a fair amount of blood, I'd say. Maybe not much, but
I
you
would have
can
thought.
certainly show a lot more than in the US.
I don't. I sure about that, because again, I can bring up the Hunger Games again, which I know you've said it. You've said apparently it's subject to some cuts in America, but I've not seen anything to suggest that it was ever cut to get its PG-13 rating. Whereas in Britain, it was subjective to not so much cuts, but digitally altering to get its 12A. And most digitally altering was like removing blood effects from from the violence. So yeah, I mean well, I mean that's a classic example of what I was referring to. It is a known fact that the BBFC are, in theory anyway, on generally speaking, they tend to be stricter on violence. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to injury detail, they'll bring the hammer down on that shit harder than the MPA ever would.
Actually, yeah, that's something. Yeah, the correction my end. MPAA are less strict on blood than the BBFC are. Yeah, that was my mistake.
Yeah,
Uh,
with the obvious exception of Terminator 3, which is another film I could probably put in the higher end of 12A.
oh god, yeah, that one. I completely forgot about that one for a second.
Although I say that, but outside that infamous hand ramming scene, there is nothing but that could be described as particularly violent in that film. And all the deaths are off screen. I mean, I remember screen. I mean, there's only three. Okay, we're talking about swearing now in terms of free F-bombs, but that is like the only graphic death in the whole film. And having watched it again, well, I'm not keen off that recently, but reasonably recently. I mean, the scene in question is quite quick, so I mean, that is going to be a discussion for ages. I mean, it's going to go one way or the other. I was watching the Nostalgia Critics episode on the film, and he said himself he did not understand how it got its R rating. It should have been rated PG-13, but then again, I have freaking no idea. That's like a reverse of the films Easy A and Dumb and Dumber 2, which, although PG-13 rated in America, they were given 15 ratings here, which boggles my mind because the reason given was for sexual content. It's like, dude, aren't you guys meant to be more lenient on that shit than the MPAA? Why in the fuck did you think they required 15s?
Yeah, that's that's kind of the whole thing. The whole theory is that the BBFC is stricter on violence, the MPAA are stricter about sex, and anything that goes out of that is a bit like, what's going on here?
That's
Something it's not normal.
Oh yeah, well, if you go on this website called High Impact Classification, I don't know if you ever have or anything. I know Mark has, but I don't know if you've ever been. Have you heard of that website?
Yeah.
There's an article they did about films that were rated R in the States, but given 12 or 12A ratings over here, and it's just basically who got it right. And there was that. Was it Richard Curtis movie About Time with Donald Gleason and Rachel McAdams in, which they couldn't tell what the who got it right, but probably the BBFC sounds like the reason why it got an R because the word fuck is mentioned 5 times, which you know what the MPA are going to be like. They hear times, but there's this other movie which starred Keira Knightley, and I cannot remember what it's called, or I can quickly Google it. For fuck's sake.
Duchess?
I don't know if it's that one. I don't. Oh God.
Just have Keira Knightley in it.
Yeah, it might be that. Yes. Hang on, I'm just going to quickly Google it. MPEAA BBFC R12A. There we go. I'm just looking up right now. Very unprofessional for a podcast for me to be doing this, but hey ho. Time, Akira.
Well, it's a filler one, so it doesn't matter.
Speech. Never Let Me Go. I think that's Keira Knightley. Yeah, Keira Knightley. Yeah. Rated Never Let Me Go. MPA rated R for some sexuality and nudity. BBFC 12A for moderate sex and nudity. Who got it right? The MPAA. I'll let the IMDb Parents Guide explain why. A man and a woman have sex. The woman is on top, thrusting vigorously and moaning loudly. The act appears to be against the man's will, and he grimaces and looks away. Her bare shoulders and part of her breasts can be seen. And they continue with, not only do we have a significant amount of thrusting / moaning that's already dodgy for a 12A category, dear God, Keira Knightley's moans in this specific scene, I'd be uncomfortable watching out with my mum now. The scene is dubiously consensual. These facts combined seem like it should have gotten the film a 15. So that's as far as that explanation goes. But that's one example of probably one a good example of a difference in attitudes towards sex between the BBFC and the MPAA. Although I think it's a British film, so it probably why it got a more lenient rating.
And also the fact that the BBFC didn't really tighten up on things like that until 2019, I think it was, when they specifically asked parents about that, and they said, "Yeah, we don't really want to see okay, trigger warning here, sexual violence at a 12A rated film. So any explicit depiction of that will automatically get a 15, which honestly I think is fine because
yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, for any good reason to give it that, I suppose that's a good reason as any.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's
probably enough.
I
think another film that we probably go into multitude of any films that might, but there's sorry, that was meant to be a sentence. It could probably go to a whole multitude of films that may have pushed for 12A to beyond its well, beyond what we might have thought was it should be encapsulated. But I think 2016's Batman v Superman and its ultimate edition, or director's cut, or whatever you call it, which was rated R in America. Although again, I'm not too sure why. Might be one of the films that could be used as an example. I'm trying to get my words out. Yeah, but I don't know if you've seen Batman v Superman.
I think I've seen like a bit of it.
Oh well, it's not a very good film anyway. But well, the theatrical version was 2.5 hours long. I saw it at cinema. That was PG-13 rated in America and 12A here. The Ultimate Edition, which is 3 hours long, bumped up to an R rating in America, but still 12 here. And of course, but to be honest, not too sure why. I think I only counted one F-bomb in it, and there's a bit of extra violence, I think. I mean, there's some scenes involving shivving in a prison, but I don't know if you see too much. But yeah, the whole tone of a film is incredibly dark and overbearing. Some people may ask questions about that, but I mean, that's just one film I thought I'd bring up in this case.
Yeah, that's another probably like sort of high-end 12A, I'm guessing, kind of thing.
Yeah, it does seem it. I mean, I think although, yeah, again, as I mentioned, there are more violent 12s out there. I mean, some James Bond films, I always thought maybe James Bond films may be the middle of the road 12A, but no, some of the Craig era ones have pushed the 12A to its limits. And I'd say I've even had to be cut to avoid a 15, like Casino Royale and Spectre. Although the other, and Quantum of Solace, I think, did as well. Although I think Skyfall and No Time to Die both got away with uncut 12As, but Bluminick, they did they made do with their with the boundaries that they had. Hope they made the best of them.
Yeah, yeah, no, they genuinely did.
All right, yeah. So I mean, that's I think that might be everything. Might be all the
Yeah, no, that's
things.
probably everything we needed to cover. So we just, in case you're wondering what all of that was just us talking about the sort of low end of 12A. So we were talking about like Ant-Man and the Wasp, etc. That vast majority of MCU films fit into that bracket. High-end films like Doctor Strange 2, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, bunch of other stuff, and then your sort of standard action film that's the sort of middle end 12, I guess. So that's pretty much the whole 12 rating we've covered, which is not bad for 50 odd minutes covering basically an entire rating.
Yeah,
Oh,
but that's now 21 years old and everything. So and has been well put to its maximum use in terms of theatrical exposure.
well, yeah, that's I mean, like the vast majority. I think isn't it the second most common rating in the UK other than 15?
It is, yeah. Although basically the films that get the 12A rating will probably be shown at more cinemas and everything. So on the front of it, it's going to look like it's the most common rating because while more films will be rated 15, there'll be smaller films that probably won't get as many screenings and or might even be relegated to smaller independent cinemas.
Yeah, that's true. So, I'm hoping that was a satisfactory filler episode, uh, as you might say. I'll should be back with regular episodes soon, but in the meantime, that's that's all for now. Thanks to Rob again for joining me
Thanks
on
for
the
having me.
podcast. No problem at all. And I will see you next time on the Secrets of the BBFC podcast.